Good evening, everybody. It's once again Ted the Speed Learner, and this is HTML lesson number 159. And I know there's going to be a lot of things you guys are going to say. First thing you're going to do is you're going to watch this whole video and you're going to say, well, this isn't the Bezier curve. Well, this is the foundation for the Bezier curve. I'm putting a foundation so that the next time I come on here, I will cover some other letters. Okay? Now, the Bezier curve is not represented by the letter A. It is actually represented by the letter Q or C. And I'll explain that later in this video. But there's a couple other questions you guys are going to be asking. One of them is, why is this Bezier curve so important? This is why it's so important. See this soup can? That's why it's so important. If you're going to try to draw this, you're going to need it. Okay? But the third question you're going to ask me is, well, you never really had any sound on these HTML lessons after lesson number 77. Now you got sound again? Why? Because this is that important. But the other question is, what took you so long to do this? What took me this long to do this? Well, I ran into a bunch of complications. And I will explain those complications later on in this video. If you stay around and stick around long enough, you'll understand what's been going on. Alright. So, all the computer code for this particular video will be placed in on my Facebook fan page, so you can just copy it and paste it, whatever. Another question you guys are going to be asking me is, why am I not putting my typical intro into this thing? Well, that's because this topic is way too important. So let's just go into this, shall we? Alright, what you're seeing on the screen right now is the HTML code of this particular project. You will notice namespaces. See, the letters XML and S stands for XML namespace. Okay, I had to have a separate SVG namespace because SVG has to be under a very specific namespace, or it won't work. So we have to separate the SVG code from everything else. Isn't that fun? That's why I have multiple namespaces in my HTML declaration. Okay? And yes, we will eventually validate this project. One of the things I want to tell you about that is that I've been having problems validating this project, and I'll explain that at the end of my video. And when I get that all fixed up in a future video, I will go ahead and present that. Alright? So, in this particular web project, we're going to have a title to this project. It's going to be linked to a CSS page. In this particular case, you probably don't really need it. And I doubt that I'll even show you the CSS in this video, but I'll go ahead and show it to you in the next one. You're going to definitely need a script tag because you're going to have to use JavaScript to access your database because you're going to need it. And then you're going to have a body tag because you're going to run a function right off the bat. Okay, that's why they have the onload event. Okay, you're going to have a button at the top of the screen which you can click, and I'll show you why to do that in just a second. Then you're going to have you're going to have an SVG tag and two path tags, and that's because you're going to be drawing not one arc but two. Okay, now, why are the arcs so important? Well, it's all based on the soup can. When you look at it up front, do you see the entire top of this can? Of course not. You don't. So you need an arc up here and an arc down here that are exactly the same size. That's why this video is so important. Because without that, you can't draw things like soup cans and other projects which you really need to draw. Think about it. Now I'm going to illustrate this to you. take a look at this car. You see that area where the wheel is? That front is exactly the same size as the back. In order to achieve that, you have to know how to draw these curves and make them exactly the same size. That's what you have to do. And I'll explain that in this video. In this particular project, we're going to have two functions. Okay? We can call them anything. The first function is going to have 6 variables. 6 of them. Okay? Now, it's going to become important to make sure, and I'll tell you this because I ran into a ton of problems with this thing. You want to make sure your variables are getting correct values. Okay? I'll explain this to you. It's called document get element by ID, and I'm going to actually flash up here. I know I got it here on my dry erase board, but I'm going to actually flash up here. What you're going to do is you're going to say, what you're going to do is you're going to, let me try to explain a little more slowly here. You're going to add a text box to your web page. Okay? Now, eventually you're going to delete that web box, that text box off your web page. Okay? The only reason why it's going to be there for a while is because you have to see if those variables are getting those values like they're supposed to. So you're going to use the statement document get element by document get element by ID, and then you'll access your text box, and you'll change the value inside your text box to whatever the variable value is, and that's how you'll do that. Okay? Now, you'll notice that I have two variables here. They're both called attribute name. Okay? One's called attribute name, and the other one's called attribute name 2. Okay? Because you're going to be changing some attributes on this thing. You have elements and then you have attributes. Okay? And you're going to be changing some of these attributes, and for a good reason. Okay? So, you have to tell the computer what attribute you're going to change. Now, what's the letter D represent in this case? Well, the D represents it's kind of a drawing thing. It says draw this particular object. Okay? And if you want to look at it more precisely, you can go ahead and do that. Fine. Okay? The other one is style. What does that mean? Style refers back to cascading style sheets. Okay? Now, you're going to see properties. Okay? Because when you're changing how an object looks, that's a property. Because you have these objects, you have their properties, you have their methods. Well, these particular objects are not going to be doing anything. They're just going to appear differently because you're changing the properties of them. Okay, remember how I had a video about objects, properties, and methods being like nouns, adjectives, and verbs? Same deal. Okay. So, we want this arc to be a blue arc. Okay? We don't want the width of the arc to be great big, so we had it small, 3. Okay? And we don't want anything inside the arc to be filled up with anything. Okay? Now, what about the M? Okay, we're looking at coordinate now. What about the M? Well, I'm going to tell you what the M is all about. The M has these X and Y coordinates. And what it's saying is, I want you to move the cursor to these certain X and Y coordinates. And that's what the computer will do. Not drawing anything yet, but it is actually moving the cursor to a certain point. Okay? Now, what about the A? The A represents the word arc. But what about those numbers? Are those coordinates? Oh, no, they're not. They're radii measurements. Okay? Ever heard the word radius? Okay, you have more than one radius. You have an x-axis radius and a y-axis radius on this thing. Okay, so that's the measure of the radius. Now, what about those last coordinates? Well, the last ones are x and y coordinates. Now, as I said, the 375 and the 200 are x and y. Boy, that's terrible. They're coordinates. Okay? So you've told the cursor with the move to statement, move to coordinate 375, 200. Okay? Now the other one underneath is 475 and 200. So basically what you've got here is 100 pixels. You got 100 pixels between the beginning coordinate and the ending one. This is important. Okay? And here's the reason why. Because what you actually have, and I'm going to draw this out for you, and this is the secret to the whole thing. Let's imagine that there are two guys. Okay, you got guy number 1 over here, you got guy number 2 over here. Now, let's say that there are, I don't know, 100 centimeters apart. Okay, this guy is 100 centimeters away from this guy. That means that this guy is only 50 centimeters from this flagpole. This would normally be a flagpole. We'll just put a little flag right there. Okay, so you got your flagpole here. He's only 50 centimeters from the flagpole, and this guy is also 50 centimeters from the flagpole. This is where you get your arc measurements of 50, okay, and 50. Okay? But it's not really 50 here and 50 here. Okay? The first measurement is this measurement from here to here. The second measurement is from here to here. Okay? So you got a little ball right here, and it's 50 centimeters from the ground. So this guy is 50 centimeters from the flagpole, and the ball is 50 centimeters from the ground. This is one radii, this is the other. Are you getting it yet? I'm glad you are. Now, what are we doing with the variable button identification? Well, what we're doing is we're storing an object inside that variable. So that variable is now going to become an object. And we do this with document get element by ID, Bezier curve button. Now remember, you now have an object inside the button identification variable. So now you can change the style properties on this button. Okay? Because now your button identification is an object. Now you're going to change its style properties. You're going to tell the button to be positioned 50 pixels from the top of the screen. You're going to tell it to be 350 pixels from the left of the screen. And you're going to tell it that the button has to be 50 pixels high. Okay, so the distance from the bottom of the button to the top is going to be 50 pixels as well. Okay. Now, what about Bezier curve identification? What about that variable? Well, it's going to have an object stored into it. And the object's going to be Bezier curve 1. So now Bezier curve identification is an object. You can now set attributes to this object. Okay? And you've already stored what attributes you want changed on this object. That's what you've done. And there you go. So, the first attribute you're going to have changed is the drawing object. Okay, you're going to have the drawing attribute. Okay, you're going to have the drawing attribute changed on this object, and it's going to be you're going to tell the computer to move the cursor to the 375th pixel. You're going to have it draw an arc, which is going to have two radii, one 50 pixels, the other 50 pixels. Okay, so. And then you're also going to have some other things. Only part of this arc is going to appear. Okay? You'll see three numbers. You see a 0 and a 0 and a 1. Now, if you have the number 1 as your third number, what's going to happen is the arc is going to appear on the top of the screen. Okay? However, if that 1 gets changed to a 0, the arc's gonna go underneath, and you'll see that a little bit later. All right, so now let's go to this one. You're gonna have some more variables. This is the second function. You're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. You're going to have 10 variables here. Now then, let me explain this to you one more time. If you were trying to draw a true Bezier curve, what would happen is you would have, instead of the letter A, you would have a letter Q. You'd have a letter Q like this, and then you would have a set of coordinates like, say, 375, 500. Okay? You'd have coordinates here. Arcs aren't run that way. Arcs are always radii. The Q and the C both, because the C represents cubic Bezier curve points, they will always have coordinates. Okay? And I'll explain that in my next presentation. Alright, now we're into the more interesting stuff. As I stated earlier, there is a second function on this JavaScript page. This second function is activated when the button on this web page is actually clicked. As you can see, this function starts by declaring variables, which I just stated. The next thing that happens is that an object is stored inside the SVG data variable. Okay? I realize that this object looks like a function, but this object now has properties and methods. This SVG data object, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to open an XQuery, and I'll show you that in a little bit. This XQuery will be used to retrieve the data from an XML document. This SVG data object will detect the opening and closing of this XQuery. The word get is a method of the SVG data object. Okay? The onReady state change is some kind of event connected to the SVG data object. In a future lesson, I will discuss these events in greater detail. The ready state event has different stages. And it's just like walking into a restaurant. When you first walk in the restaurant, you haven't placed your order yet. That value is 0. Okay? So you haven't requested anything, so therefore you are at 0. The next ready state sets up a request. Okay? So that would be like if you walked into a restaurant, you started reading the restaurant menu. Now you're setting up what request you're going to make. The next ready state makes a request. It's represented by the number 2. That's when you actually walk up to the counter and you order something. Okay? The next ready state processes a database request. That would be the equivalent. Now you're at number 3. Okay, you're at ready state process number 3. This would be the equivalent of the restaurant worker gathering your food and putting it on a tray to give to you. Okay. The final ready state in this thing is going to be the number 4. This is when you actually pay for the food and you take it with you. Okay. Now, either the clerk's going to put it on a tray, put your food on a tray for you, or it's going to be bagged up. It doesn't matter either way. The point is that in the end, you pay for it, you take it. That's number 4. Okay? So, we now have a ready state, as you can see in the instructions. It's now at number 4. So, what does the computer do once the ready state is at the number 4? Now, I want you to notice the double equal sign between the SVG data dot ready state and the number 4. You must use a double equal sign in this kind of a statement according to the rules of JavaScript. Okay, you have to show it's absolutely equal. Now, SVG data has a response text attribute, and the data you retrieve from the database has been successfully stored in this attribute. Unfortunately, you can't just use it from the attribute. Oh no. You must store the value of the response text attribute into a variable. Okay? Because otherwise you won't be able to use the data. Now this function is going to draw 2 Bezier curves. Our extra query retrieved the data for both curves. So that means that all this data needs to be separated. You got it from the database, now you need to separate it. Okay? So, first thing you're going to do is you're going to separate the data from the first Bezier curve and the data from the second one. So you're going to separate those two out. And that's what you're seeing right there in the code. Now, when you separate the first Bezier curve code from the second one, you also have to separate the data within the remember, you just stored all that Bezier curve information. You have to separate that information out further. Okay? And that's what you're seeing in the code. Now, once all this data is separated out, you get to use your set attribute, which I just demonstrated to you earlier in the text. Okay? Now, the SVG data.send event triggers the ready state change. Okay? Now, this is very important. I want you to take a look very carefully at what I'm pointing to, because I'm pointing to those braces. Okay? If you don't have the braces in the right order and the correct stuff, you're going to have some problems. Now, we're going to focus on the data that this web page is accessing. Okay? This data has been stored in something called XML. Nice thing about this thing is it's a text format, and it's really easy to send on the internet because it doesn't take up very much room. Okay? Now, I formatted this data for a very specific purpose. Okay? And you say, well, why did you separate everything? What if you're trying to do an animation, and what you're really wanting to do is you're doing an animation, and what you're wanting to do is you want to change one particular set of coordinates, but you don't want to change everything. Okay, you don't want to change the distance or whatever. You just want to change a set of coordinates. Instead of having to go through this entire statement where you have to read the thing from left to right to try to find which coordinate you want to change, you can just go through this XML document, find out exactly what you want to change, and then just change it real quick. You can see how the XML is very easy to read at this point. Okay? The problem is that all this data has to be validated. That's why you have to have this XML schema. Okay, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the XML schema. Now, look at the bottom of this XML schema. Okay? This XML document has one main element to it. Okay? And then it has all these child elements after that. Okay? And so therefore, you want to reflect that in your schema. You want to say, okay, it's accessing this main element, and then it's going to access all these child elements, and make sure that they're all set in the way they're supposed to be. That's why you have a schema that validates your document. And that's why you got to run an X query on this and see if the document is valid. Okay? Okay? Because you have the SVG data element, and then the first child element of the SVG data is Bezier curve 1, and the second child element of SVG data element is Bezier curve 2. Okay? Now you notice that the Bezier curve 1 and the Bezier curve 2 elements have child elements of their own. So that's why we have a Bezier curve 1 type and a Bezier curve 2 type. You'll notice that the Bezier curve 1 type and the Bezier curve 2 type have identical child elements. This is perfectly acceptable. There are two things you should notice. The namespaces in the XML document and the XML schema document, they match. And the XML document provides an address of the XML schema. So now we're constructing the XQuery document. Since the exist database upgraded since the last time I loaded an HTML lesson video, I wanted to take the time to point out a couple of changes that you have to make to successfully execute this XQuery. One thing you have to change is near the top of the screen, the other one's at the bottom, and I'll point these out with arrows. The first thing you will have to add is an import statement, because it has to import a computer library into your project. Go figure. Alright? So, in order for this thing to process successfully, you have to import a library. But let's look at the end, at the bottom part of the XQuery. Okay? This is where you're going to find something called a JAX-P. What's a JAX-P? Well, this exist database program is running off of something called Java. Not JavaScript, but Java itself. This is why you had to install Java 11. Okay? So, the letter J in JAX-P stands for Java. Now, what about the letter A? Well, that stands for the acronym API, but there's a problem with this, because API in itself is an acronym. What does that one stand for? Well, the first letter in the acronym stands for application. How many applications do you have on your smartphone? You call them apps, but they're really applications. Got a ton of them. Well, exist is an application. Go figure, huh? Now, you can't really store the exist database on your phone. It would take too much room. However, if you have a tablet, you can. So there you go. What's the letter P stand for? Well, it stands for the word programming. So what you're doing is you're using this application to program the exist database to execute your XQuery command. Okay? What is the letter I? Well, the letter I in API actually stands for interface. Okay? So you are interfacing with the exist database. When you're programming the exist database, you're interfacing with it. Okay. So, you create XHTML documents or HTML5 documents. That's right, you're going to go up to HTML5 now. And you create JavaScript documents, cascading style sheet documents, XML documents, XML schema documents, and even XQuery documents. Alright. The next letter, which is X, in JAX-P, okay, JAX-P has an X in it, that stands for XML, you already know that acronym. The letter P stands for the word processing. So basically you're using the Java computer language to process XML. And the exist database is the application you will use to execute Java code to process XML. Now notice the letter XS. Well, this statement has a namespace, and that namespace can be found in the import module statement. The word Boolean is either true or false. That's what it is. Boolean represents true or false. So, You can see there are two variables in this document. First one is instance, and the value of that variable is the location of the XML data. And then the other variable, schema, which has the web address of the schema document. Okay, then we go ahead and validate this XML document, and you can see it's valid. Okay, let's finish this lesson, shall we? Okay. Alright. So what is this thing going to look like once we throw all this code in there? Well, take a look. You now have two arcs that are exactly the same size. One appears on the top, one appears on the bottom. And they are exactly the same size. You can see that for yourself. Alright. Now the information in this particular video can actually help you fix the $double project that we did way long ago. And it can also help you draw the soup can. Okay? Now you can form two arcs exactly the same size and draw the soup can. You can draw the wheels. Not necessarily the wheels themselves, but that area, that wheelbase or whatever heck you want to call it. You can leave the name of that down here in the description box below, but you can see, you can draw that too. And all kinds of neat little things. Sure you can. You now can make equally sized whatever. Now, as I promised at the end of this video, I was going to tell you why it took me so long to present this video. Now, why didn't I add my typical introduction to this video? It's just far too important. And I seriously doubt that anybody's going to watch this video unless they really are serious about programming. And I hope you are. Okay. So, the first reason it took me this long to present this video is due to the poor explanations that I found on both on web pages as well as books about the topic of Bezier curves. You really don't explain this thing very well. What I needed to know is how to form perfectly equal-sized arcs, and they just didn't explain it at all. Not really. Okay? They didn't actually specify why the arcs are the way they are, especially with that radii. I thought those were coordinates, and that's what really threw me off. Okay? Now, not only did I read web pages, but I read books on the topic, and then on top of that, actually I had to watch several YouTube videos before I caught on. Hopefully you won't have to go through all that. That's what I'm sparing you from. Now, as I explained, the areas where the wheels of the car are, the soup can, whole 9 yards, that's the reason why you have to know about equally sized arcs and how to draw them. Now, another hurdle I ran into was that things apparently have changed at the Exist headquarters, wherever that is. Used to, they just answered just about anything you had. That doesn't seem to be the case much anymore. I don't know if they are working as much on this stuff or what, but they're still friendly, but they're not as friendly as they were 6 or 7 years ago. Things have apparently changed, and that's really sad. But it got worse because I actually went to a place called Stack Overflow, and they're relatively nice people too, but they've been trying to push me into something that I don't want to be pushed into, and that is something called JSON. You say, well, what is JSON? Well, the letters JS stand for JavaScript, the O stands for Object, and the N stands for Node. Apparently, JSON is slowly taking the place of XML, and that's going to become quite a problem for me because I like running my databases off of XML. And I hope XML doesn't completely go away from me. But I will be learning JSON really soon, and I will present some JSON information. I don't like JSON as well. I mean, yes, it does work better with JavaScript, but it's not as readable as XML is. So, all right. Now, XML, HTML, and now this JSON are open source computer codes. It's unfortunate that Microsoft is not, and they are becoming far more proprietary by the day, and I don't like that. So, I'm going to try to stick with the Exist database as much as possible as I continue these projects. I suppose I could try to run this stuff from LibreOffice. It is free, but I don't understand it as well, and it could cause some complications there too. So some of the data that you would want to use probably can't. So, okay, as I noted earlier, the Q and the C are used for Bezier curves. Q for quadratic, C for cubic. They do actually have X and Y coordinates to them. Okay. I will also be covering in another video a topic called UTF-8. This list of special characters will be useful for you to use in future XHTML and now HTML5. You'll be able to use that UTF-8 in that. I will also discuss the topics of XML and XML schemas in greater detail in future videos. That concludes HTML lesson number 159. I hope you learned a ton. I will do my best to process this video as quickly as I can. I can't guarantee when this will pop up, but I'm sure you'll benefit from it. I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.